So when we last left off, the camera was working, I'd got images from it, and I was pretty happy. The one thing that was bothering me about it was the bellows. They were functional and they worked, but they just weren't perfect. The rest of the camera I built to a really high quality, and the bellows just weren't there. So I had broken down and ordered some bellows. So the first step was replacing those bellows with the new ones when they arrived. And wow, what a difference they made. The quality of the construction, how flat they sit, it's night and day compared to what I had to what I replaced them with. Interestingly, during the process of disassembling my old bellows and putting the new ones in, I did discover some ever so minute little leaks on the left-hand, right-hand side where it glues to the front standard. And it was strange. They don't show up when the bellows are sort of at their normal extension, but when I closed them down for the 90mm and the 135, that's when there was sort of an angle or a cantilever that caused them to open up ever so slightly. So I was fairly sure that was the cause of the vast majority of my light leaks. So I removed the old bellows and glued the new bellows in. Following the installation of the new bellows, the last thing I wanted to check was, there was a comment on one of the previous videos that someone had mentioned that the mount that I'd adjusted on the front standard to take the new lens board might be also a cause of light leaks. I was fairly sure that wouldn't be an issue because the way I'd sort of measured it and way the lens board mounted in, I couldn't see how the adapter plate that I made, the 3D printed adapter plate, would allow any light leaks. And when I'd been testing the camera before looking for the mysterious light leaks, I couldn't see any around the lens board at all. But with an absolute of caution, I thought I'll just check that out as well. So with the new bellows attached and the light leaks, or the edges around there guaranteed to not have any light leaks, I once again got my black shade out and a torch, and lo and behold, there was just an ever so minute amount of light leaking in from the left and right hand sides of my lens board adapter. Not exactly sure how that works out, but thank you to the comment. All I had to do was add a very thin gasket of foam, and now the lens board, it's quite a tight fit now. In fact, it's probably almost a little too tight. When I attach the lenses, I really have to sort of yank down on that top little bracket that holds the lens board in. But now, absolutely no light leaks from the front standard, and definitely no light leaks from the rear, where I have glued the new bellows in around. So with all of my light leaks dealt with, or at least I hoped, and the new bellows installed, I had one last little thing I wanted to deal with. With the last set of negatives, I did notice that there were a couple of very fine, minute scratches on the negative. And in looking at the actual film back, I noticed that there were just a couple of little bits of leftover gunk from the 3D print around the edges of where the film rides across that could possibly have caused those scratches. So first things first, I removed those. It was a fairly simple process. But just to be sure, I also got some 1000 grit sandpaper and sanded down the edges of where the film travels across to make sure it's as smooth as possible. So I headed out to a place called the Yallourn power station, which is about 2 hours east of Melbourne, on a nice sunny day, thinking this is going to be great. Shoot off some test frames, test each of the lenses out, and theoretically I should be done with the project. So I found my first composition and got my film back out to load up my roll of XR 100, and put the film in and closed the back up and started winding the film on, and immediately noticed that there was a lot of tension. It was incredibly tight. Now when I'd created the 3D model, as is always the case with me, I'd made all of my tolerances incredibly tight. I didn't want any slack or any movement anywhere. And I do think that the tolerances of where the actual film spindles sit is perhaps just a little too tight. And I have noticed that, there are actually slight variations in different spindles from different brand film companies. And I have noticed, some are tighter than others, but this was significantly tighter. And then I noticed that even though I was winding on, nothing was moving. And then that's when I realized that the little spindle that I'd created to wind the film on had come loose. I wasn't sure if it was where I'd glued on the little 3D print, or it was actually where the spindle was then connected to the little knob on the top, but no matter what I did, I couldn't wind the film on. So with a heavy heart, I gave up, put the camera back in the car, but decided I didn't want to waste the drive out. So I went and did a bit of recce, and I actually managed to find a better composition than what I'd originally been planning. So the day wasn't entirely wasted. So I headed all the way back home to try and fix the film back. When I disassembled the film back, I immediately found two problems. One, the super glue that I'd used to hold the little 3D printed connector that clips into the spindle had come loose. But more than that, the metal dowel that goes through, the grub screw that connects to that metal dowel that holds the knob on both the take-up and the rewind had come loose. They just weren't tight enough. And when I did try and tighten it, I found that it was just tapping out and just coming loose again. So I got my Dremel out and I grounded a little flat recess for the grub screw to seat in. And then I also reprinted off some new spindle mounts with slightly longer travel to allow more of the glue to sort of set up. And I re-glued, and I'm fairly sure I was pretty happy with the way the spindle was working. So I was ready for my next shoot. Just before I headed out, I decided to make one last stupid addition or change to the film back, which future me is kicking past me in the head. I was a little concerned that where the film cassette mounts onto the film plate, I have these 4 little cams that hold it in place. And with a lot of removing and placing it back on, I've noticed there was just a slight amount of play. And I just was worried that maybe that might also be where there might be a little bit of light leaking in. So just in case, I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll double up the foam edging around it, the gasket that holds that in place, which I did. But then by adding the additional gasket, I had to adjust the little cams. They weren't fitting correctly, so I decided to try and heat them up and melt the plastic so it would raise up a little bit. In the process, I managed to burn some of the gasket that was the film seal, but got it to a point where it was quite tight fitting, but it was holding in place. The last thing I did was also I had a piece of felt in the back of the film cassette, sort of acting almost like a pressure plate to hold the film flat. And I was a little concerned that that was pushing the film onto the film, the front of the film plate, and that was causing those scratches. So I removed the felt because I felt that, you know, with the tension of the film running across, the film should be pretty flat enough as it is. So I removed that and I was ready to go and shoot another test. So I dropped the film off and waited for it to get developed. In the meantime, I had a little side project. I'd seen a YouTube video about a film scanner. I think it's called the Image Scan. I think it's a Hasselblad film scanner. It's a very old piece of equipment, and you need an old Macintosh to run it, and it's slow and painful. But I did notice that the tray that it uses to mount the film and load it in has this interesting system of it uses a magnet sheet basically to hold the entire negative flat. And one of the issues I've been coming up with, especially with the larger format of 6x17, is I've got 3 different film trays for my Epson scanner, V850. I've got the original that came with with the 750. I've got the upgraded one with the 850 that has the anti-moira sort of plastic tray in it, and I also have an off-brand one I bought on AliExpress. And all of them have differing issues, but all of them don't ever seem to hold the film perfectly flat. There always seems to be sort of a misalignment, and you can never get it exactly flat. And then what happens is inevitably I either end up putting the negative in a way that it's not straight, or I'm messing with it so much that I'm touching it and inevitably causing issues there. The more time negative spends out in the air, the more dust it's getting, and it was bothering me. So I decided to see if I could replicate the scanner tray from this old school scanner. So once again, 3D printed off a tray, and I ordered some sheets of magnet. And basically I have a magnet, one section of the sheet mounted in the scanner tray, and then on top of that I have a sheet that sort of sits on top that holds the film in place on every edge, theoretically holding the film as flat as possible. It didn't take too long to build, and I have to say, from the looks of it, it's doing a really good job of holding the negative significantly flatter than any other process I've seen short of wet mounting, which is not something I even want to get close to doing. So with my new scanning tray in hand and my film fresh back from the lab, scanned in my images. And yeah, where do I start? First off, there is definitely noticeable light leak on both sides of the image, almost definitely caused by the felt that I've added, or the additional gasket felt I added to the back to theoretically stop light leaks. I've managed to cause more light leaks. Then I also noticed there's this really strange stair-stepping kind of exposure change on the negative. And I mean, originally it looked almost digital. It doesn't look like an analog error. And so I immediately assumed it was probably the scanner, did some testing, found the scanner was fully functional. And then looking at it and sort of scratching my head for a while, I think what I finally decided what the problem was the distance between each of the stair steps seemed roughly to correlate with the amount of distance traveled every time I wound on the film a little bit as I'm winding from one to the next. So what I think was happening was, it's almost like when you're doing a test chart, when you're developing in you're developing a print. You will, expose for 5 seconds, blocking off most of the paper, then 10, 15, 20, so on, and you can sort of see exactly where the exposure is. The stair stepping was every time I was winding on the film, that portion of the film was getting slightly less light than the next part, and so on and so forth. So once again, it was a light leak. Those two issues look dealable with. But then the biggest issue, which was the one that really just gutted me, was I shot Ector, which is a really nice sharp image, and on the left-hand side of frame, so much detail. It was amazing. I loved it. Then to the middle and to the right of frame, completely soft. And pretty much what I decided was the case was obviously the felt backing that I'd removed because I didn't think I needed it, and I didn't think was necessary because I thought that was going to cause the negative to scratch along, or possibly assist in scratching the image, was actually doing its job and had been holding the film perfectly flat along the film plane. By removing that, the film was not perfectly flat, and just that small difference, the felt I used, I think from memory, is less than 1 millimeter. That small difference of deforming of the film had caused most of the image to be out of focus. So with all of that in play, I decided the best option was to go back to the drawing board and print off a new back and a new film cassette, adjusting the tolerances on the spindle, tweaks here and there, and also turning on a thing called ironing, which I didn't even know about in 3D printing, which would make the surface of the print even smoother to make sure that there was no chance of the film scratching. So I used all of my learnings from the previous one and printed off a new film back and a new film cassette. And I have to say, it probably was worth it. I had done a lot of learning from the previous one, and so the new one was significantly, the design was very similar, but just the way I constructed it, and each of the steps of, you know, where I glued and where I, what I used for gasket material and so on, I just increased the quality of it just a small amount, and so that the actual back itself looks a lot better. A couple other little tweaks I just added just purely because I was reprinting the unit anyway, is I added 2 little catches on the right hand side that would hold the dark slide in place whilst I was traveling. It wasn't moving or wasn't falling out or at all, but I just was worried that one day maybe when picking it up out of the camera bag or something like that, certain angle or something like that, I might accidentally move or just jar the dark slide slightly. So by having these little catches, the dark slide cannot move until I choose to remove it. And so yeah, with that, I was ready to go for another test shoot. So I didn't want to waste another roll of film, but at the same time, I needed to do another test shoot. So I went deep into the fridge and found a roll of Ilford XP2, which is black and white film, but it's designed to be C41 developed. It's 400 speed film, not my favorite. I used it back when I was doing a lot of developing at home, and I didn't want to have both black and white chemicals and color chemicals, so I had C41 chemicals. So I bought a bunch of the film and had some good results, but you know, it wasn't something that I was really too bothered by. So I decided to run that through the updated reprinted film back and to see how things went. So rather than drive 2.5 hours out of the way again to Yallourn, I drove 10 minutes out of the way down to a bridge nearby for sort of a car overpass that I'd sort of seen, looked at, and sort of could have discounted as being interesting but not worthwhile actually shooting. But it had enough detail and different elements in it that I'd be able to definitely confirm how focus was working, and also it might result in a good image. So I got the camera out and fired off a couple of frames using the 1:35 and the 2:10. I didn't shoot with the 90, the shot just didn't work with the 90mm. And I also shot another test focus frame back at the house just to confirm that my re-addition of the felt back to the film plane had caused everything to be perfect. So shot those off fairly quickly, shot them off to be developed, got them back the same day, came back home and scanned them in, and breathed a sigh of relief when there were no light leaks and everything was in focus. Looking at the focus test chart, like the first one, I did notice that focus is probably, I want to say, and this is at f5.6, probably 2 to 3 centimeters forward of where I actually focus on. But realistically, if I'm shooting and I'm shooting at f16, everything that within 3 centimeters is going to be in focus. And the change in film plane height to adjust for that would be probably somewhere in the realm of 0.2, 0.3 millimeters, moving the film plate back. I'd have to reprint an entire new film back, and even then, tolerances on 3D prints, getting that exactly right would be near on impossible. I did consider, and I have actually modelled an updated film plate, which I haven't actually printed. It's sort of sitting there for the future, being able to add shims so I can raise or lower the film plate by very small amounts. And so I thought what I could actually do is get some very thin aluminum, get that CNC cut, and I can actually have some aluminum shims, so I can actually take the film plate back by 0.1 of a millimeter at a time. And I've added some other tweaks and changes to the design, but at the moment I can't be bothered reprinting it because what I've got now is fully functional, works perfectly, and is exactly what I wanted. So with all those problems dealt with, as far as I can see, the camera is now fully functioning and ready to be used in the field as a camera, which means that's the end of this little series, and I'm going to have to come up with something new to make YouTube videos about. What could I possibly do? Maybe I could stupidly add a 210mm lens to a Hasselblad X-Pan? No one would do that, that's just stupid. In the meantime, say hi to your dog for me.